Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a spring garden. This is based off a reference image that I found in Pinterest, and it's one of those pictures with a full-on composition and many colors that sometimes I find a bit tricky to break down and simplify, and I personally like to use these types of images for practice. So on the left here is the reference image. As you can see, there's a clear background and a foreground, so I'm just going to separate the foreground at this point. I scaled the wall at around 2/3 of the page, and then I finish it off with a diagonal line at the bottom. This way I can follow the perspective for the rest of the items, like the seating area as well as the window. For this composition, I'm using a very simple one-point perspective, but the horizon point is somewhere off the frame. So you want to make sure that any feature you're drawing on, like the seat as well as the window, is getting slightly larger as it gets closer to us. After drawing on the seating area, that's when I'll place down the cushions as well as the blanket. And I'm not following the shape of the cushion and the blanket completely from the reference image, but I'm just using the idea of the composition. When you're drawing out the blanket, you want to make sure that it falls vertically down to the floor. Don't get confused by the diagonal lines from the perspective, because anything else that's vertical will stay vertical, just like the frame of the window. And for the blanket, I just want to draw out a few folds as indication when I paint later on. And after this, I'm going to move on to paint the surrounding plants. For the plants, I'm just going to leave them very loosely since I like painting them freehand later on. So I just want to indicate the spacing for now. Obviously, we're not going to paint every single leaf one by one, and it's a little bit crowded here, so I just want to indicate the flow of the viney leaves and take any feature that I find would complement this overall composition without making it too complicated. Now let's go over the colors that I'll be using. Firstly, this is Chinese White by Holbein, Quin Red by Daniel Smith, Titanium Gold Ochre by Schmincke, Sap Green by Holbein, New Gamboge by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, Sepia by Holbein, and Cobalt Blue Hue by Holbein. I'm also going to be using Bleed Proof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. So let's begin to paint. I'm going to start out by painting on the background. I wet the area of the background evenly, and then I use Cobalt Blue to paint on the sky first. I just placed most of the blue at the top, and then I pulled whatever's left downwards. This way the bottom is slightly lighter than the top, but generally I want the sky to be quite light in value. Then while the surface is still damp at the bottom, I continued it with some muted green by adding New Gamboge and Sepia to the Cobalt Blue hue. Then at the bottom I added more New Gamboge for a more yellow green, and you can just keep on playing around with the ratio to create different tones for the background. I'm keeping everything light because I want this to be separated from the foreground, which is going to be much more saturated. Here I'm creating a different tone of green by using Sap Green and New Gamboge. I'm going to use it to paint the grass area. I'm just going to extend this color to the foreground. Then I'm going to follow this up with a darker green to paint the plants underneath the sitting area. And for this, I use a mix of Sap Green, Cobalt Blue Hue, New Gamboge, and Sepia. I'm still using a pretty heavy load on my brush, and the consistency is quite watery, so it's easy to spread. Still using the darker green mix, I'm going to paint it over the area of the background where it's a little bit more yellow-green, and this time I'm painting on a completely dry surface so the brush marks can be a bit more textured. Then with whatever is left on my brush, I paint it horizontally across the grass area. I'm not going to do this all over, I just want to indicate the flat plane on the background. But as I get towards the foreground here, I'm using a slightly thicker consistency to paint some cast shadow maybe from the viney plants, and this time I'm making it more diagonal as it's closer to us, so the plane becomes a bit further apart. The bush in the background should still be a little bit damp, so I'm just going to take advantage of it and use this orange mix from New Gamboge and Vermilion to dot in some flowers. I'm going to leave the background for now and start painting on the foreground. I'm going to start painting on the viney plants, and here I switched to my Chinese calligraphy brush, and I'm using a medium to thick consistency of the yellow-green mix to paint on the area randomly as a base color. And the reason why I chose a Chinese calligraphy brush for this is because it's quite flimsy, so my brush strokes are a bit more unpredictable compared to using my usual round brush. While the surface is still damp, I'm going to follow this up by using the dark green mix from earlier, and I'm going to place this randomly around the inner part of the viney leaves, just like as shown as the reference image, but along the way I'm still trying to create those really unpredictable brush strokes, so the base kind of looks a little bit abstract. I'm going to leave those viney leaves to dry and move on to paint the base color of the wall. For this, I just use a mix of titanium gold ochre with a bit of sepia in a light consistency to cover the area. But just like usual, I like to alternate the colors slightly, and at the top I can see from the reference image that the shadow is a bit more reddish, so I added a little bit of vermilion into the mix. As it's closer to the foreground, I want the color to be a little bit brighter and more vibrant, so I just use titanium gold ochre by itself. Here I'm slowly working on the darker values, so I'm using a slightly thicker consistency while the surface is still damp. And as you can see, I'm also directing my brush a bit more horizontally, or at least following the perspective of the wall. This way I can start to establish the plane of the exterior. Next, I'm going to paint the inner side of the window, and for this I'm using the same mix with added sepia for darker value. Ideally, I would prefer whatever I painted beforehand to be completely dry so the paint doesn't travel too much, but it's okay since this is just the base color. And as for the inside of the building, I'm just adding even more sepia for an even darker value. Remember while you're painting this though to avoid painting on the pot of hydrangeas. Now that the wall exterior is completely dry and the base color is nice and faded, I'm going to start adding on some of the leaf textures which overlaps those areas. For this, I'm using the previous green mixtures, and of course you can play around with the ratio to create different tones. I was visualizing grape leaves when I was painting this, so I'm just trying to depict a looser version of those types of leaves, more or less in the allocated area according to the reference image. From the reference image, you can see that on the right hand side the color is a little bit darker compared to some of the leaves on the left side where the light is hitting it. So some overlapping leaves are a little bit darker compared to the lighter ones with the light directly hitting behind those leaves. So here I'm going to play with a mid-tone green as well as a yellow green that I alternate randomly to try to suggest or depict that scenario. So I'm going to just go over the color mixture quickly. The main green that you can use here is either sap green or a mix of New Gamboge and cobalt blue. The more cobalt blue you add to the mix, the darker and also the cooler the temperature is, but you can also increase the value by adding sepia, and if you want the color of the green to be a little bit more warm, you can also add a little bit of vermilion. Since I'm already painting on a lot of the leaf textures, I'm going to paint on the viney leaves that is draping across the exterior close to the window as well. As you can see from the reference image, there's a bit of vegetation next to the cushions, and since I want that part to be painted loosely so it doesn't take away from the cushions as the focal point, I dampened the background before adding on the green tones, so the base color of this vegetation is a bit blurry. Next, let's paint on the hydrangeas. I'm going to use a mix of Quin Red, Cobalt Blue, and Chinese White, and I'm going to play around with the ratio so I can have different colored hydrangeas. With this color mixture, you can either create a dark purple, pastel purple, periwinkle blue, or a soft purple pink color depending on the ratio that you're going to paint the flowers with. And as I was painting on these flowers, I realized that the background needs to be darker so the color of the flowers can pop out more. However, I did this while the surface of the flowers are still damp, so the colors end up merging into each other, at least around the edges, creating something that's a little bit murky. So just be mindful of this when you're painting on the background. Make sure that the flowers are completely dry. After looking at the reference image, this is when I realized that there are patches from the light on the cushion, maybe from areas of the leaves which has openings. So here I'm just going to mask those areas first using my silicone brush. I just find that by using this it's much easier to create random shapes. I'm going to place this all over the sitting area, and I also want to spread it to some of the plants next to the cushions. Just going to leave the masking fluid to dry, and meanwhile I'm just going to paint other elements of the painting. Here I'm using a mix of New Gamboge, Vermilion, as well as Sepia for a brown to paint the pot for the hydrangeas. So the color of the pot isn't too flat, I decided to add some vermilion into the previous mix to paint around the pot as well as underneath the flowers. Next, let's start painting the texture of the wall. I'm going to start by painting on the bricks for the arch of the window. This is the same color mixture as the pot, which is from Vermilion, New Gamboge, and Sepia. And just like usual, I play around with the ratio in order to create different tones. And as you can see, I left out a white negative line in between all the bricks for the joints. I'm going to leave them dry for now and use more or less the same color mixture in different consistencies as well as different ratios to paint on the rest of the wall texture. I'm not looking at the reference completely, so I'm using it as reference, but I am making things up along the way since it doesn't have to be 100% exact. If anything, we just want to suggest textures instead of painting every single stone according to the reference image. What I'm deducting from the reference image here is that the bricks are more exposed on the left side, whereas on the right side of the wall you can see larger stones or even patches of the concrete covering the exterior, and I'm just going to work with that information as best as I can. I can also see that some of the stone colors are a bit more cooler compared to the bricks. It's even a bit grayish, so to include some of those colors, I added cobalt blue into the mix for the cooler neutral tones. Even the exposed bricks are a little bit different, so here I'm just going to work in patches and different color tones and combinations. And as I'm painting this, just like the bricks for the arch of the window, I left out white negative lines for the joints. As I get towards the bottom, the texture of the bricks change. This looks more like exposed stones, so I'm making them a little bit thicker and more rounded. After covering all of the surface, I'm going to add a mix of Quin Red and Cobalt Blue into the browns, and I'm going to use this to paint underneath some of the stones as shadow. After adding on the shadows though, I thought that the stones were going to be a little bit lighter as it dries, but it didn't fade as much as I wanted to, and I find that there were just too much details and the edges were just too sharp, so I ended up smudging everything with a clean damp brush so it becomes more of a soft background. But looking at the reference image again, at the top here there are some stones which are a bit darker, so I'm just extending the darker values further. Now that the masking fluid is completely dry, I'm going to paint on the cushions. I really like the bright pink because it stands out against the background. So here I used a mix of Quin Red with Chinese white to paint the base. Then while the surface is still damp, I used a mix of Quin Red with Cobalt Blue and Sepia for the shadow on the right hand side. Next, I added a bit of cobalt blue into the previous pink mixture, and I'm using a light consistency here to paint the base color for the second pillow. Then while the surface is still damp, I took a thicker consistency of the same mix to paint the darker values on the right hand side, just like the previous cushion. Now for the flat seat cushion, I'm going to use blue, and for this I just added more cobalt blue into the purple mix with added Chinese white as well, and I used a thin consistency to spread it out evenly. Then for the darker value, I added more cobalt blue with a touch of sepia, and I'm using a medium to thin consistency to paint on some line textures, and I found that the color was a bit too strong, so I decided to soften the edges using a clean damp brush while spreading the color slightly. Then I'm also going to add the darker shadow at the bottom. For the pattern of the long pillow, I just used the dark red mix from the shadow of the pink cushion, and I just painted on straight lines following the curvature of the pillow. Now let's move on to the blanket. I just used the purple mix that I already had on my palette, and I just darkened it with a little bit of sepia. I just used this in a very light consistency to paint some of the folds and the shadows from the folds of the blanket. I wasn't sure what kind of pattern I wanted to paint on the blanket, so I just made something up. I used the pastel purple mix and just painted on flowers. You can also make more aesthetic colors if you want. You can use things like buff titanium and make neutral colors, but I just want this to be light and happy. So after the purple flowers, I added on some yellow dots to introduce a complementary color. Then I also dot in some vermilion for another bright color. Since the pattern was painted in a medium to thick consistency, I felt like the color was a bit too strong, so I decided to smudge some areas with a clean damp brush. After that, I want to increase the values, especially for the folds of the blanket, and for this I used a mix of Quin Red, Cobalt Blue, and Sepia. I want the color of the seat to be different than the wall, so I just repurposed the colors that I already had on my palette, and I added buff titanium, and it came out to this mauve color. And after that, I'm going to paint on the potted plants as well as the bush beside the seat. First using a thin consistency, and then going back in with a darker consistency of a darker value green. As for the pot, I used new Gamboge and Vermilion with a bit of sepia. Don't forget to also paint the plant on the right hand side here. As you can see on the reference image, this area is in shadow, so I went in straight away with a dark green. Then with the same dark green, I'm also going to paint the plants underneath the seat. After painting on some of the base color, I'm going to go back in with a slightly thicker consistency of the same green to paint on more of the leaf textures. Now, after adding the darker value, I felt like the wall was a bit too light, so I decided to go over it again using some of the wall colors, but I made sure that the texture is much more loose and less detailed. I'm also going to paint a dark brown underneath the window and also to separate the pot from the background. Once the sitting area is completely dry, I'm going to take off the masking fluid, and as you can see, the edges are a bit too rough and the shapes are also a bit glaring, so I'm going to just soften some of the edges using the base colors. After that, I'm going to add subtle details using the purple that I used for the blanket to paint underneath the pillows. I'm also going to refine the pot on the left by using the dark brown mix from Vermilion, Gamboge, and Sepia. And I also want to make sure I paint the shadows underneath the plant on the pot as well. Now I'm going to glaze a little bit of the yellow-green for the grass since there's a bit too much contrast between the values now. And for this I just used a mix of Sap Green and New Gamboge. Once I'm happy with the green, I'm going to paint on the branches as well as the stem of the viney tree. For this, I use my Chinese calligraphy brush again because I find that I can make much more dynamic line weights with this. While painting on the branches, I also want to make sure that some branches are peeking through the leaves at the top part or the denser parts of the tree or the vines. This will make the area of the leaves look less dense and a little bit more airy. There are some tall flowers on the left here, so I decided to just draw some stems and then I just painted pink flowers on top. So it doesn't look too flat, I decided to vary the color by adding a bit of purple underneath while the surface of the pink is still wet. Then for more colors, I decided to use this red by mixing Vermilion and Quin Red to paint the flowers on top of this flower bush. Now going back to the murky hydrangeas, here I'm using a light consistency of bleed-proof white to paint more detailed flower petals on top in the highlighted areas. And instead of just leaving this bush on the right, I decided to add some white flowers with yellow centers. Now I feel like I need to add some shadows underneath the viney leaves. This is just to separate the greens and the wall since the values are quite similar and it looks like they're merging into each other. So I'm just placing on some of the browns that I still had on my palette. After this, I'm going to unmask the sides thinking that I completed the painting, but like usual, there's always something to still add. So here I forgot to paint on the vine support underneath the leaves. So I'm just going to paint it on by mixing bleed-proof white into the brown to make the brown more opaque. Then I use a darker brown to paint the shadow underneath. In this area, I also felt like it needs a bit more separation, so I'm just picking up whatever brown I still had on my palette, preferably a darker value to paint around the cushion. After glazing on the grass patch, I've also lost the detail of the cast shadow, so I'm just going to use a muted dark green to paint on some leaf textures to represent the shadows. And if you've also unmasked your painting, I'm sorry for misleading you, but if that's the case, please be careful when painting around the corners because the sides are no longer protected with masking tape. Just make sure the lines or the edges are clean. And that's basically it for the final touch-up of this painting. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see more, please consider subscribing for new videos every Friday. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. Thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!